To the anointed, greetings. Yes, they laughed. Yes, they pointed. They questioned your value before they even understood your name. And now, your name appears on documents they were never meant to see. Even Elon Musk, a symbol of disruption and dominance, has just received notice tied to a secret account. And it bears your name. That's not coincidence. That's consequence. A consequence of underestimated energy finally cashing in. You were never just the underdog. You were the blueprint in disguise, the misunderstood prototype. They criticized you in rooms you weren't allowed into, misquoted you, rewrote your intent, tried to measure you with systems built to suppress, not to see. But you kept building in silence. You kept moving. And now your impact is undeniable. You've stopped responding to noise. You started delivering outcomes. You stopped asking for permission. And the world started making room. This isn't a moment. This is arrival. This is the reward for those who refuse to bend to mediocrity, for those who turned isolation into fuel and ridicule into raw material. They tried to shatter the mirror, but all they cracked was their own illusion. Welcome, chosen one. Your name is no longer whispered in mockery. It's written where only the powerful look. And the world is about to discover what happens when the overlooked finally unlock what was always theirs. Would you like this styled as a social caption, voiceover script, or short video concept? We are talking about an entire table-turning approach, not just turning the other cheek. You didn't give the clap back. You came back. By doing so, you challenged the critics' whole narrative and accomplished more than just keeping them silent. Get ready as we discuss 14 heart-wrenching, brutally honest truths about how you took back control and made your silence matter. You can be sure we left out the cliche that silence is golden nonsense. Trust me, if your silence had a cost, your opponents would be bankrupt. Let's get started. First of all, you saw that your opponents' remarks were a reflection of their own anxieties rather than your honesty. Finally, you understood that their criticism had nothing to do with who you were. It was always about them, never about your mistakes, flaws, or decisions. It was about how your presence changed the way they saw themselves. They weren't reacting to your reality. Rather, they were reacting to their own discomfort. When you finally understood that this was never a personal issue, it hit you like a lightning bolt. Humans really project. Dismantling things they don't comprehend is easier for people than admitting that they feel threatened by them. People will label you too much. They will criticize your choices because they are uncomfortable with how right you are, not because you are wrong, while they secretly wish they had the bravery to be even half of who you are. When you defy their expectations, your growth, confidence, and determination are more crucial. They want you to stay little. As if it were your fault that they hadn't done the work, they projected their issues onto you instead of dealing with their own, since something within of them was triggered. You've merely become a reflection. You were never the problem. Mirrors are reflecting and honest as well. When they looked at you, they saw what they couldn't control, what they weren't, and what they hadn't healed, so they didn't see you. This is why their comments were hurtful. You still hadn't realized that they weren't about you because they were true, but rather because they were never about you in the first place. But as soon as you saw it fully, everything changed. Instead of taking in their poison, you started to see it. You stopped protecting yourself and started to pull away. In this manner, you reclaimed your power without ever having to say anything. You just keep moving freely, unimpeded, and finally untouchable after realizing that their hate is a result of their own misery, and you no longer feel the need to absorb it. Second, you quit seeking approval from those who didn't originally believe in you. You finally stopped trying to win over those who had never been your supporters in the first place. Everything altered as a result. For a long time, you kept going there and explaining yourself in the hopes that others would understand you, accept you, and even give you a pat on the back. To prove your worth to those who secretly hoped you would never realize it on your own, you went above and above, and that's when the change happened. You started to see how exhausting it was to attempt to please people who enjoyed ignoring you. They reduced all of your good deeds. Anytime you tried to explain yourself, they would either show that you were being too sensitive or mislead you. They knew deep down that you were brilliant, but they didn't want you to realize it either, because if you did, they would no longer have control over you. You used to think that if you just worked harder, explained things more clearly, remained silent, or cooled down, others may finally see your heart. As you now know, it wasn't that they didn't notice it, rather it was because they were afraid of it. You were never invisible. They would act as if they didn't see you, so you would keep shrinking to fit in. Now that you've realized that their validation is cheap and that your value is certain, you don't shrink. Those who are unable to use your power properly are no longer granted it. You don't need their likes, fake smiles, and reluctant support. You are making your own world, not a tourist to theirs. When you decided to stop performing for their praise, you were sincere because you were loyal to your strengths, your objective, and yourself. They started to watch then, ironically, since nothing scares a reviewer more than someone who no longer merits their admiration. Third, you found freedom by utilizing your silence as a statement of strength rather than a defense. You understood that silence was a strategy, not a sign of weakness. The quiet that comes from fear or loss is not the same as the calm that comes from knowing exactly who you are and no longer needing to defend it. At one time, you would have fought back, complained, tried to protect your name, and corrected the lies, but you finally understood the game and fled the chaos. You had finally come to the realization that your voice was too valuable to be squandered, not because you couldn't speak. You found tranquility by not answering. You saw that some people were determined to give you misleading information, not misinterpreting you. No matter how honest you were, they twisted it. No matter how kind you were, they didn't believe it. You stopped trying to be heard by those who only ever listened to your responses. Your silence turned from a retreat to power at that moment. You weren't quiet because you didn't have anything to say, and you remained silent because they weren't worth your breath anymore. Strangely enough, the silence started to create sounds at that point. Your constant presence became less noticeable than your absence. They knew when you stopped answering, when you stopped sending SMS, and when you stopped showing up. The silence that they had once taken for granted started to torment them. The issue is that although they may disagree with your opinions, they cannot ignore your growth. When you stop participating, you also stop giving them the fuel they need to keep control of the narrative. You made the boldest move of your life when you chose to use your silence to smother their unrest. Not talking shows that you're not giving up, not that you're holding back. It means that you are denying other people access to your thoughts, emotions, or reactions. The most obvious sign of your progress is that you are now moving consciously rather than in a panic. You no longer argue with people you've outgrown. Fourth, you stopped waiting for permission and started to demand respect. You're tired of playing down who you are in order to appease others. Are you tired of awaiting permission from those who never meant for you to go forward in the first place? You were so desperate to be accepted that you kept reducing yourself to fit in with people who didn't know how to use your full potential. You used to question everything you did, wondering if your presence was too much, your voice too loud, or your aspirations too huge. Then, in the most elegant way imaginable, something inside of you broke. You stopped waiting for permission to be yourself. You realized that you had to build your own entrance and stop knocking on locked doors, since no one was coming to write your script, co-sign your authority, or give you a crown. And when you did, everything changed. Instead of being arrogant, you started to clearly demand respect. You were no longer begging. You weren't justifying yourself, avoiding other people's anxieties, or defending your goals. You were aware that playing tiny meant betraying oneself, not being humble. As a result, you made a thorough and unqualified decision for yourself. The odd aspect is that when you made that inward transformation, others started to treat you differently. Not because they changed, but because you did. Your energy level was different. Doors that had been closed started to swing open as you moved into areas as if you were welcome. It's not because you were eventually accepted, but rather because you stopped waiting. In actuality, waiting for clearance would have prevented you from succeeding. The version of yourself who is standing in your truth right now is the unstoppable version. Once you stopped asking and started to take charge of your region, the world had to change, so that person is valued just for being there. Fifth, you recognize the source of your criticism, people who couldn't control your brilliance. The moment you stopped looking to those who couldn't even control their own shadows for approval, everything fell into place. You realized that those who were criticizing you weren't trying to quiet you because you were weak, but rather because your light exposed the darkness in their own life. The brightness of your presence looked hazardous to these people who were so used to living in their little shadowy corners. The saddest thing, however, is that you ascended for their benefit and never had to impress them. At one point, you thought their words meant something. You wondered why they didn't understand you, why they couldn't see your worth, and why they didn't approve of all you did. You thought it was about you. But when you took a step back and thought about it carefully, you saw that it was your ability, not your actions, that was causing them distress. They detested your determination to stay in the cage they had tried to put you in because it forced them to face their own stagnation instead of applauding your progress. You stopped reducing your shine to ensure their comfort. You stopped attempting to be as brilliant as possible, to avoid being noticed, to be safe, and to soften your edges. Because your light made them think of all the things they hadn't done and all the things they didn't have the courage to be, you discovered that certain people would always feel uncomfortable around it, not because you were doing anything wrong. You eventually accepted the fact that you would not be allowed to conceal your brilliance. It's meant to shine, even if it blinds those who can't handle it. You started to be yourself and stopped apologizing for your intellect. And as soon as you did, you saw that the crucial individuals weren't that important. You were never meant to walk with those who couldn't manage your brightness anyhow. Sixth, even though they tried to make you seem weak, you knew you were strong. For a very long time, you let their ideas to define what strong should be. They twisted what they saw, your capacity to remain strong, remain calm under pressure, and always get back up, into something negative. They called you weak, soft, or inactive because they couldn't figure out why you kept acting like you didn't hit people or make noise. To them, strength was always aggressive, loud, and powerful. However, you managed to see through that illusion. You realized that true strength is about surviving while everything else is falling apart around you, not about flaunting your strength to others. You weren't good at controlling the room or making a point. It was shown by the way you remained true to yourself despite efforts to undermine it, despite the world's cries for you to relinquish control. You were able to keep your cool. That was in your quiet resolve, your ability to forgive without forgetting, and your readiness to defend yourself when others did not. It doesn't need other people's praise since that kind of power is independent of other influences. They tried to make you seem powerless, but in reality, they saw another incomprehensible kind of power. Your poise, your strength, and your unwillingness to exact retribution. It made them question the authority they had been taught to revere, which made them afraid. To be powerful, they thought, was to destroy others. But you found that your own strength is what holds you together when everything else attempts to break you apart. And when you recognized it, everything was different. You stopped doubting yourself and started asserting your authority. You gave up looking for the loudest, most visible form of strength, and instead chose to embrace the quiet power that comes from knowing who you are, living by your values, and rising without ever having to shout about it. They will never be able to overcome that kind of strength, no matter how hard they try. You realize that your journey was always about you, not others, at number 7. For a long time, you believed that other people's opinions determined your worth. You had to live with their voices in your head, dictating your decisions, controlling your behavior, and molding you into what you thought they wanted you to be. Since you thought that this was the key to happiness, you worked very hard to live up to their expectations in the hopes of being accepted. You did, however, finally reach a point of emotional, spiritual, and mental exhaustion. The constant struggle to fit in with someone else's idea of success had worn you out. It wasn't until you took a step back that you realized something important. Your journey was never intended to be about them. When you stopped attempting to live up to their expectations, you really began living for yourself.
Perhaps it's a remark, an observation, or perhaps just a gut instinct. However, they are increasingly challenging the narrative that was imposed upon them. They are only observing, mute witnesses to a deception that can no longer be maintained, and they are not yet speaking up. The funny thing about the truth is that it accomplishes this without having to yell. It just requires a few people to start thinking independently, to see beyond appearances, and to start recognizing what has been concealed in plain sight. It doesn't have to persuade everyone at once. The once solid communal illusion starts to disintegrate as each individual begins to awaken. The falsehood comes undone, one silent insight at a time. Along with it, the campaign's whole basis starts to crumble. The worst part is that they still don't anticipate it. They continue to believe that they have persuaded enough people to accept their interpretation of reality. In actuality, however, the more they speak, the more others observe and pay attention, and the more they begin to doubt what they are saying. On the basis of groupthink, the falsehood may have seemed to be a stronghold, but today, it resembles a house of cards. Additionally, it gets closer to toppling with every new individual that awakens. They are unaware of how loud the quiet is. It is the sound of a gradual, inexorable collapse. Seventh, you are now their unresolved business, not their objective. They believed they could remove you from the story at one point. They made an effort to deny anything had occurred, bury it behind a mountain of falsehoods, and close the chapter. In their tale, they wanted you to be a footnote, a lesson learned, or a far-off memory that they could manipulate with their own interpretation of events. The problem is, however, you didn't disappear. You did not vanish. The screenplay they created for you was not followed by you. Rather, you remained there. You continued to change. And suddenly, you are their unresolved business, rather than their objective. Since the narrative they made up about you is no longer logical, they are unable to let it go. The story they created to explain their conduct and the falsehoods they used to defend their acts are both disintegrating one by one. They attempted to shut the chapter, but were unable to do so because of you. And every time they believe they have moved on, a part of them begs them to go back and look again at the story they believed they had resolved. They are obsessed with resolving a story that was never based in reality. The focus has changed. It's no longer about destroying you. Even if they tried, they couldn't. You're too steadfast and grounded in reality. Making the tale make sense now involves attempting to find the connection between what they stated about you and your true self. The issue is that the facts will never match. No matter how hard they try, they are unable to alter reality. The proof that refutes all of their claims cannot be removed. They grow more exposed the more they rotate. They believe they could shut the book on you and control the story. However, you are not a forgotten chapter. You're the unfinished business they can't get out of, the tale they can't change. Additionally, it just becomes messier each time they attempt to fill in the blanks with additional falsehoods. They are stuck in a cycle from which they are unable to break free, and you serve as a continual reminder that the truth only has to be made known. It doesn't need to be changed. Number 8. Their covert envy becomes more obvious the more they converse. They first pretended to be concerned. They made an effort to give the impression that they were protecting others and that they had a moral obligation to warn about you. However, it is increasingly difficult to keep up that act the more they chat. Every statement they make and every charge they level reveals a deeper reality that they are no longer able to conceal. It is now a confession rather than slander, and they admit that they are envious. Every time they try to undermine you, they're showing their jealousy. They've gotten so obsessed with you that their own hatred and bitterness are seeping through their words whenever they attempt to portray your success or tranquility as something threatening. Protecting others from you is no longer the goal. Instead, they are attempting to undermine you in order to feel important and superior. They find it unbearable that your strength, progress, and genuineness appear to so easily surpass their pathetic efforts. Everyone listening can now painfully see what was formerly covered up as care. People are beginning to realize that all of these cautions and efforts to incite people against you are based on something much more intimate than they first disclosed. It's rivalry masquerading as care.